Hey, here we go again. Mostly hairless apes are back at it. I realized I've been talking all about a lot, just a bunch of stuff, and I should have. I should cover some background. I should realize that you have to understand where you come from to know where you're going, and all of that stuff. I'm old. I'm old. Like I'm recently retired. Been a little giddy about it. I realize I have to be careful because most Americans don't get a shot at retirement. Is my understanding of the numbers. But retirement's pretty fucking awesome. I did the math and I realized I could make the same money sitting on my ass. Not that my wife lets me do that often. I've got a retirement account, Social Security, and Medicare, and decent insurance. As I was a drone of the state. Everybody bitches about government, but I have to say personally, I've had a pretty good life being a drone of the state. I'm a retired biologist. I went to school, and as much as, and maybe going to Catholic school was a good thing in that sense. That because people who complain about public school and all the recent surge in homeschools, if you look back at the history of public schools, they were developed primarily as a response to the industrialization of our society. How do you make good compliant workers? Is you make them show up at the right time, you ring the bell, they show up, they perform to standards, they jump through hoops, and they listen to the rules, and they're good citizens. And not that that's not necessary for a functional civilization. It's all a matter of degree. That's one of the things I've learned as a biologist, is that binary digital information is a great decision making process, but in our brains, there's a lot more fluid information. Information flows between a variety of things in our brain. We've got different combinations. And you've got to do the math, and you got to do the calculus and integrate the curves, and do that fun things to really appreciate how your brain's working. So what I had the beautiful option of being told, figure out what you want to do. And I'm not sure everybody gets that nowadays, but I did. I pursue your dreams. I don't know. Well, I guess that's not totally true. They told me that, but then they also said there's no money. So I went off to college with an ROTC scholarship, and I can graciously call something military service, and I had a few student loans, but I earned my bachelor's degree. Go Gamecocks! I paid off those student loans years ago. I just paid off the last one for the kids a little while ago. But I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for years, and then I needed to be even nerdier, so I went to grad school. And that paid for itself if you didn't mind choosing frequently between ramen soup and beans and rice. And a few years doing research, and then I got into teaching whatever you say about it. Well, and I'll admit I'm not a very good bench scientist. I'm not. I'm a little too ADD to stay focused on the problem, and my brain bounces around. So teaching worked. I was able to cover lots of different subjects. I've taught anatomy and physiology to pre-med and nursing students. I've taught neuroscience. I've taught cell biology. I've taught immunology, and a smattering of other courses. And but then I hit the retirement point, and I said, "Hey, I'm here to go." Um, Living in my own home, I'm hoping to pay it off in a few years. Had 4 children, minimal convictions, conceptions, or addictions. Pretty great life. But I've come to understand that my situation is not that common. Not as common as I think it should be. I mean, something over half Americans don't have any sort of retirement. Almost two-thirds live paycheck to paycheck. Not to mention the debt loads, and that's part of the whole idea I've gotten into with probabilistic ethics and information theory and writing the Bible. I mean, maybe we should create the evolving church of science. Because where does that come from? Well, I grew up in the church. I was raised in the Roman Catholic faith. I'm a recovering Catholic, I like to say. Not my phrase, but it works. I'm the fifth of 7 kids. So lots, second generation American mom, first generation American dad, but about 96% Caucasian according to the genetic testing. So I'm an old white guy. Folks paid for Catholic school. I'm not sure what the rationale there was. There was a little bit of keeping up with the Joneses in my family growing up. My maternal grandmother ran a family business, and she cleverly cornered the market for the local Catholic schools, the uniforms, which I think was a huge chunk of their income. And they did a women and children's clothing store. And so mom did that, and her sister, and lovely old Aunt Betty, no longer with us. None of them are. That generation's all gone for me. But they were basically first generation Americans, did the whole World War II thing, the greatest generation. I had an uncle who was mayor of the town, another uncle who made a fair amount of money as a contractor, and then their two sisters, my mom and Betty Ann, ran the business. And so they had their own little, familia there doing things. And coming out of that, one, I learned the value of extended family. That's one of the things, too. The nuclear family is its own creation. I think it'll feed back into the big picture later. But an old world view of the Cosa Nostra, the old our guys, our stuff, and it was family taking care of themselves. I mean, going all the way back through European history, you could probably find a lot of the organization was built based on family. Whatever local lord, baron, feudal king in a different area had their own little lands, had their own groups, and it would have been families. And people would have known each other. Little outbreeding would have helped at different points. But we had inbreeding, which is why you get some really nice conserved genetics. When you look at Czechoslovakians or Poles or Germans or Finns or Swedes, all of that stuff, because they were all anchored into these societies. And when those societies got a little too constrained, the impulse for growth, the basic biological impulse, let out to it. And then it was a perfect storm for the rest of the world. Because about 500 years ago, what was feudal systems developing mercantile exchanges, had some trade routes with other parts of the world, but then Western Europe busted out with new technologies. They figured out navigation, and the Portuguese and the Spanish figured out military might, the gunpowder that they apparently picked up from the Chinese, and but put all that together into weapons of war and colonization and sailing ships. And Western Europe basically took over the planet starting about 500 years ago. And over the last few centuries, colonialism was the rule of the day. I mean, if you go around the planet, it probably peaked back around 1900. I have a lovely document marking the immigration of my paternal grandfather from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and no longer wanting to be a subject of the Emperor Wilhelm, I think, over there. I forget the name, but who was in charge at that time. But he came over right around 1912, right before WW1, the Great War. They didn't give it a number at the time. It was just this huge war, primarily between the royals. And that family history resulted in just being part of the melting pot of America for me and mine and my family. Grew up in a little small town called Manville, New Jersey, and that town is still there. Lots of white folks still there, but a lot of Central Europeans clustered there, as people from other areas did at the same time, because they were carrying over that beautiful biological phenomena of family, that the extended family tree branched out, and that's the whole idea. I think that's what's so alluring about the mafia, the Sopranos, and all of that, and the Godfather, all of those legendary components of society really grew out of what was the main thing for most of Western civilization. It was all these small, interlinked family units. Someone who rose to had a title and ran the land, and people worked together to have their own communities. But then what happened in the all that science and tech spilled out into the industrial age, and with the age of colonialism, we took over all parts of the planet. And they used to say around 1900 that the sun never set on the British Empire. I think technically it still doesn't, as the Great Britain has, the United Kingdom has a few remaining protectorates, old colonies all around the planet, tiny little islands and things. But what happened there? How did we transition from small feudal villages up into global empires? Well, it transferred during the industrial age. It gave people the resources to dominate other people. And the machinery and the weaponry and the transportation and the communication that all evolved out of science, the technologies that were adapted, allowed people to build bigger and bigger networks, and they moved beyond the basic family. And, and this is the weird one, because after World War One, what fell were all the royals. Whatever else you say about the royals and the aristocrats in society, they were family. They had their own family, so on one level they understood family, and so they allowed interactions with other families. The family unit was considered a support network. It's how you could get away with squeezing them really tight with taxes and things, because everybody had their own social safety net where they took care of everybody within the family unit. Of course, there was poverty. Of course, there was people squeezed out. You got rid of weird old Uncle Ernie if it got too weird. Things were handled pretty brutally, sure. But then, once the industrial age kicked in, what you had was huge migrations to the city, to the urban centers, to the manufacturing centers. More money being produced because more products were being produced and being sold. And all of that money filtered up to the top. And what happened in the 1800s, transitioning at the end of the age, and right before World War One, was that, and the reason the royals lost power was because the industrialists took over. The capitalism became the dominant thing. So we used to have family relations with monarchies. We had the church telling us what we should do. But then you got capitalism took off. And it was mercantilism before that, state-sponsored commerce. But now you got independent aristocrats. You've got these industrial aristocrats who built their hierarchies around given empires of commerce. And that's been competing with the royals. And the royals lost. The royals got shot up. They shot their own foot in World War One and knocked down most of those empires and succumbed to revolutions with the Bolsheviks. And then it got into then we had dealt with the initial rise of some of those plebeian aristocrats, Hitler and Mussolini. Those guys all tried to step up with physical domination. They reverted back to basic biology, basic natural selection. If we get more weapons and more people and we can kill you, we win. And that settled into the Cold War finally. And that's who I am, really. I'm a child of the Cold War. Dad served in World War II in Korea. Brothers just missed Vietnam. I was a little young for Vietnam. I was done by the time I hit of age. I was 15 when Saigon fell. And I got to watch all that. I got to watch Watergate growing up. I got to watch the moon landing. I got to watch the state do really neat stuff. But then also fall on its head as they acknowledged, Nixon acknowledged the criminal aspect of government, the fact that any big bureaucracy is going to be corrupt. There was a marvelous book back in I believe in the 70s called The Peter Principle, and it basically discussed why you get incompetency in bureaucracy. The idea of the Peter Principle was you rise to your level of incompetence. Because think about a bureaucracy, think about any institution. We have to have lines of communication and organization. And what made a family so tight. If you had a patriarch or a matriarch, whoever ran a family, and his or her word was law within the family. When you had this tight little group, local little feudal lord, everybody was local, communication was local. It was more efficient in terms of you knew exactly what the rules were pretty early on. But then what happened when we got business in charge, when we got commerce as the main component as opposed to worshiping the king or the god. A little atheism here thrown in. And that's thanks to Chucky D, Jar Darwin. We've got some of that aspect going on, that we lost those components of society. I'm not saying we want to bring them back. I don't think we want to bring back the age of kings or priests running things. But who's running things now? Who runs things now are the economic aristocrats, the people who've climbed on top of different commercial pyramids and literally make billions of dollars by manipulating markets, by manipulating cash flows through the system. And they're really the ones who are setting the agenda because they pay the politicians. And the politicians don't really, they just have to manipulate enough voters in their district, which is the whole issue with gerrymandering and these party systems that we've gotten into because we had a spark. When we left, we were some of the first ones. Our ancestors here in America, the English and the Scots and the French, grew out of that English empire. Makes sense that the top empire of the day, the British, would have been one of the first ones to have a significant breakaway. So everybody had colonies: the English, the French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch. All of them had colonies out of Europe. But obviously, the English were the largest. They went naval. They took the navy to the seas, and they controlled most of the commerce. And and as you go up, as you build these bigger hierarchies, you've got to put more force into it, more energy into it, because of entropy, because of inefficiencies. That goes back to information theory, the idea that if information is an essential component of biological systems, in order to have a social network, you got to have good lines of communication. And what happened during the 1700s was that communication started to break down because having a global empire without satellites and phones and all of the stuff that came later, everything was communicated with huge time lags. That's how we got the age of pirates in the Caribbean, and as people were breaking away and making their own rules because it was fragmenting. And then the colonies broke away, and the U.S. broke away and said, "Screw you guys, we're not going to do this." And obviously, we had the wars and everything over the year, but people realized if there was enough land, they could just make their own way. And that's what eventually happened all through the 1800s into the 1900s. The colonies started saying, "The hell with you guys." And they kicked out the royals. The royals collapsed. They stopped making money, and the industrialists took over. And we thought we were all free. Democracy arose. The Bolsheviks, even the Russians, initially were going to do communism, and they thought it was democratic, but they ended up defaulting back to one-party rule and having, as opposed to inherited aristocratic families, it was just whatever. If you were a good apparatchik and worked your way up the ladder, you too could be Vladdy Putin and get to the top of the heap and become a dominant aristocrat, a plutocrat, whatever you want to call them, a dictator, an autocrat, somebody who doesn't have any significant challenges to their authority, as they rule through physical force. And part of that it gets translated, and we still do it in this country. We've taken some of that physical force and turned it into commercial, economic force, because economies are really nothing more than social systems to distribute resources. And however we use cash in those economies to code for the value of things, the value is manipulated by the people who run the market, who control the cash flow. And whereas governments tried to do it for years, they're starting to fall by the wayside. Now we're seeing the crumbling of that. I mean, the rise of Bitcoin and cyber currency is an indication to me of the fall of the last democratic societies because governments aren't going to be able to fund things. They're not going to be able to run things because they tried to do things by taking care of people. But what we're going to have, and we're moving towards it, is a capitalization of everything. We're going to have monetization of everything in society because that's how the industrialists like it. That's how this new breed of aristocrats like calling the shots on things. Because the Cold War really wasn't about communism versus democracy. Communism, in its purest sense, was democracy. We said, "Oh, the people should be in charge. We don't want these aristocrats anymore." And that's what the democratic revolutions were with the U.S. and France and all the countries that went democratic, all the colonies that broke away. But votes can be manipulated. That's what the aristocrats realized. And the old kings knew it, and the new aristocrats know it, the industrial aristocrats know it. Because if you can manipulate votes, you can get people to vote for whatever you want. And the way you do that is by lacking ownership, because the real issue was really between democracy and capitalism. And capitalism is all about who owns something. Because that's what happened in Russia. Russia supposedly had democracy with communism, but they just got autocrats. And then when they finally said, "Oh no, all right, we'll go true democratic," and they tried to do elections, they just passed over all those state enterprises to a bunch of cronies, and they just created a whole new aristocracy of Putin and his buddies over there. And we're doing the same thing here. We're allowing these big corporations to buy up politicians. They manipulate people. They piss off. They tell the left of diverse people who can say, "Oh yeah, anything goes. You can be gay. You can be straight. We don't care." And we don't. I don't care. But the point being, they're a party of a whole bunch of people who it's harder to organize. The other side of the aisle, the Red Hatters, are people who have embraced an old school religious leadership. They want to bring back the religious leader, and they want to have this person who's supposedly going to take care of them because God's on their side, this master, magical, mystical deity. And that's my main problem with the Red Hatters. As opposed to considering diversity, which takes a little more thinking, they like to fall back on letting someone else make the decisions and say, sure, that's the right thing. I mean, it never fails to make me a little sick when I deal with somebody who's telling me from the conservative side of the aisle, I'm not racist or I'm not anything, but we should have this practice. And they don't bother to look at the long history of colonialism and show that they actually understand how the world evolves and how we could have gotten to this modern age whereby theoretically, we have this American dream. I mean, that's the thing I think I've been able to do. As a baby boomer, I'm a tail end baby boomer. I've gone through all these generations. And that's evolved into, well, we'll run the state. You go to work, you do what you want, you get a job. If you have any talent, you can make some money doing something, and you can buy whatever you can afford. Because that's the real trick. Until you get to a point where you're financially independent, you really can't have a true democracy. Until people own their own life, and that's the whole idea of everybody being a king of their own castle, king of the hill. If I own my own home, if I own my own car, I'm making enough money to take a retirement and go on vacation, then I can truly stop and think about political issues. I can vote on things with a clear conscience. But if I'm scraping to get by, if I'm living paycheck to paycheck like the majority of Americans, then I'm totally influenced by the economic powers of the day. Whatever the big bosses say, and that's who we're dealing with, whatever they say goes, essentially. And that trickles down, and nobody can confront that system. I'm hopeful that I've heard the alphas talk about the new generation, and my grandkids are part of it. The people who are growing up with a totally cyber linked world, people who grow up with cell phones and tablets and computers that you can talk to and respond to, and AI, they're going to have access to communication networks that are inconceivable to us older folk. Because what they're going to be able to do is link together and form relationships around the planet. And they'll get tired of this bullshit. Because I think the real problem and the reason we should have an evolving church of science and a new faith in science and rationality to run the planet, because it's the best way we've come up with to solve our problems. Thoughts and prayers don't cut it. Thoughts and prayers are bullshit. Because in reality, they might be praying, but nobody's thinking. There's not a lot of thoughts going on. That's the problem. The public systems of education that have evolved, in this country at least, as far as I can tell, really spend more time about how to suppress somebody to follow the rules, to make sure you go out and get a good job and work in the industry and take whatever job you can get. And now we've shifted to the gig economy and people have to make their own way. Well, that's what it's going to be. We're all going to be independent contractors, and we're going to have to reform our social networks. I think our social networks should reform and recapture some of that old biological function. I think they should be relatively small, and I would think the functional evolving social unit actually would be this extended family network. And I think that's where we're going, because that's all that still works. Because the government doesn't work anymore. Nobody has any trust in anybody. Because we don't have any shared ideals. We don't have any belief in anything. But if you believe in science, if you accept reality for what it is, that we're mostly hairless apes, we're evolving social primates who live on the planet and share this network, and there's 8 billion of us, we have to come up with a functional government that defines how we're going to behave toward each other, and a functional economy that says how we're going to trade resources. And right now, capitalism runs the markets, and the governments are failing. And they're devolving back to straight physical force. They're just falling back to, and nobody can agree on anything. And we can try to recapture that through some level of logic if we have a common belief system. And the only one I can think of is this idea of belief in science, the belief in logic and reason, that we are not children of some magical deity. We've had thousands of deities humans have created over the years. And if I don't believe in Jesus as God, it's no different than saying I don't believe in Allah as God or Buddha or any of them. Pick Thor, Zeus, Imhotep. Take your deity and put it out there, and I don't believe in any of them. And why you believe one or the other, what it does, though, is stops your ability to think. Because if you stop at some point, you stop your brain thinking, you give up thought as a process, which is very easy in our chaotic, information overloaded world. And you don't have any time to think just about yourself and who you are, or bother to find out. And if you do, the only thing, or the thing that makes the most sense to me, is that I'm a mostly hairless ape. I'm an evolving social primate who is at this point in history because I was taken through my development by my parents who had their own baggage. But I had this marvelous chance to study life itself, to be a biologist. And when I study life and I look at it as a functioning network system, as an information processing set of organisms, what I see is that a bunch of us are willing to just accept as is, and we're not willing to take the initiative and say, what if we could change things? What if we could form different networks and change the rules about how we behave? And that's, I think, where a lot of people are there in one form or another. But the thing we have to acknowledge is the reality of the environment. The reality of limits. That's one of the biggest ones. What science teaches us is there are limits to different things. You can only push through so much energy through a system. There's a reason ATP is used in energy currency in cells in metabolism. All of this stuff goes into the idea that there are limits on things. And what we've got with capitalism as opposing rationality and saying everybody should be free to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is this overriding capitalist system which has excessive ownership. And that's where we have to cap it. We have to put a limit on it. We have to step up and say there's a boundary of how much wealth you can accumulate just because you've tapped into global markets. It's not a matter. You had a great idea, Mr. Google, who had came up with stuff and said, "Hey, we can have this great distribution network." But that's the idea. You should get rewarded for that. But how much is it worth? $10 billion a year, or is it worth $100 million a year? $100 million total, and money that should trickle down to all the other employees who are distributing goods, who give us a global marketplace. That's the kind of stuff we should be regulating. We should go ahead and acknowledge that in reality, government is primarily for first and foremost the economy. That how we choose to do things is based on what resources we have available. And I can only stop and think if I have enough resources to stop and think, to be able to not get up every day and have to go to work, to not live paycheck to paycheck, to look forward to a retirement where I can sit down and calmly assess things and have weekends and holidays and all of these civilized things that we've had that I grew up with that are slowly fading away because what do capitalists want? The owners who have capitalism want us to do more. They want more. They want more employee work. They want more productivity. They want bigger profits. Everything is short term. Everything is time is money. And the pressure is constant. Why? Because there's no limits. There's no limits to the amount of wealth that can be accumulated. So if somebody climbs to the top of an economic pyramid and they're the self-proclaimed owner of a whole bunch of stuff, they get to be a king. They get to be an aristocrat. They get to say the rules don't apply because I have enough lawyers. You can sue me thousands of times, and I'm just gonna fight them all the way to the bench, all the way to the courts. And we're at the same time they're gonna poke holes in government and say it doesn't matter. I've got more money. I can buy my way out of this. And as long as we have that, we can't have democracy. We have to have a civilization that needs to be built on logic and reason, and with minimal rules. I agree with that. We should have more freedom up to the point where you're hurting somebody. But the only way you can do that is if everybody has access to resources that are adequate for sustaining a stable life. That's what we want. That's really what was the great age in America. A time in the 50s when you could go down to Main Street and go to the record store and go to the soda shop and go to the high school dance, and everything was calm. But we need to extend it beyond a select group of white people and build it for the world and let everybody build their own communities. And the best way to do that is to say that capitalism is a marvelous system, but it needs to serve democracy, and we need to serve the people by saying, all right, we got to distribute resources better, and so we got to up pay. Everybody should earn enough. Everybody should earn enough to have health care and education and homes and food and nutrition and a little bit of recreation and a retirement, which I think is really awesome. All right, so next time we're going to talk about the 10 suggestions from the Bible. Talk to you guys soon.